The John Fugelsang podcast is now available 6 times a week with me, John Fugelsang. I've been murdered on CSI, picketed by Westboro Baptist Church, and hosts Tell Me Everything on SiriusXM Progress 127. You will hear authors, politicians, actors, filmmakers, rappers, rock stars, journalists, activists, unhinged callers, and way too many comedians. They all have a place on the John Fugelsang podcast, and so do you. The John Fugelsang podcast, fair and biased. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to pods.
Stephanie Miller's Happy Hour podcast. Hey, remember when we started it, we said if Donald Trump makes you want to drink and swear, this is the podcast for you? Doesn't he still want to make you drink and swear?
Yes,
because he won't
does.
ever shut the F up. Will he ever? He won't ever go away. Won't ever stop saying the election was rigged and made to make it.
So we're going to keep drinking and keep making happy hours.
Yes, it's happy hour somewhere. We live by that. And
Yeah.
this is the best interviews of the week on the Stephanie Miller Show. Whoever the big newsmakers are, politicians, comedians, we have just amazing guests.
Yep.
And happy hour focuses on the very best of the Stephanie Miller Show that week.
Yeah, and we have a lot of fun making it as well.
Right.
So you will have a
Fun is still allowed.
Yes. In Donald Trump's America, yes.
It is hard to believe, but fun is still allowed, particularly on the happy hour. And lots of swearing, lots of drinking, lots of...
Whatever gets through the night, whatever gets through the day, that's what the happy hour is there for.
It's available wherever you get your podcasts, correct?
That is correct.
And sexyliberal.com. Get it now. Stephanie Miller's Happy Hour podcast.
Welcome back to Facepalm America. I'm Beowulf Rockland. Thank you so much for being here. The American right has, since the 1950s, been on a drive to gain power by exploiting the bigotry, paranoia, and extremism that exists in this country. It really has, to an extent, at all points. It's always been there under the surface, and now it's kind of out in the open. But the Republicans back in the day, they were farming it, and they brought it to the fore for the first time in a while. And while they've never been more successful, I think, in doing this than in the Trump era, we can't really discuss the MAGA movement without talking about the efforts of the GOP that got them to that point. Here to discuss this with us is David Corn. He's a #1 New York Times bestselling author, an investigative reporter, and his new book is American Psychosis. David, welcome to Facepalm America. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. So after World War II, the same party that had overcome the Depression with the New Deal had defeated fascism around the globe. They were Democrats led by Roosevelt and then Harry Truman. And as we entered the Cold War era, the Republicans found an opportunity in that. How did the American psychosis, which you describe, first manifest itself during the McCarthy era, and how did that foreshadow what was to come?
Well, to begin with, as I note in the book, there has always been a strain of paranoia and conspiracy theory in American public life and politics. Yeah. You can go all the way back to the Salem witch trials. Yeah. You had the anti-Illuminati movement of the 1800s. You had years later, the anti-Masonic party, which was actually a political party based on a conspiracy theory. And then there were anti-Catholic conspiracy theories that were a big part of politics in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So it was always there, under the surface, used in different ways by people of different political parties. What happened after World War II is that you saw the Republicans finally land on an issue that would work for them, and that was McCarthyism. As you noted, FDR, the Democrats, had won the war, had saved the nation with, the New Deal during the Depression and the war years, and they had decimated the Republican Party across the country and in the Senate and the House. The Republicans come along, and first it was Richard Nixon, and then it was Joe McCarthy, and they recognized there was a unease amongst many Americans in the post-World War II period, Cold War tensions, and the advent of nuclear terror that they could exploit. And Joe McCarthy got out there, kind of like leapfrogged over Nixon, and said there was a conspiracy so immense, and it was that people running the government, the Democratic administration, were actively plotting to weaken and destroy America so that the Soviet Union could take over.
Yeah.
It wasn't that their policies were wrong and that they might weaken the United States. It's just that there was a plot to do this. This was the goal, the aim. And he named George C. Marshall, who had been the Army Chief of Staff in World War II, helped to win the war, who had had the Marshall Plan and helped to save Europe, and who is now Secretary of Defense for Harry Truman, as the leader of this cabal.
Yeah.
And the Republican Party went along with this. They saw that McCarthy and other Republicans took this line, were able to win elections, and they lionized him at the 1952 Republican Convention. And it kind of set in motion the embrace of this extreme paranoia that they weaponized and politicized. And it worked. Yeah. It worked for in a lot of different ways. And you saw the party, it's not as if a light bulb went off, but from that point on, the Republican Party has always had this dark side, doesn't talk about it, often undercovered by the media, that exploits and encourages extremism. That can include racism, paranoia, conspiracy theories, tribalism, resentments, grievances, nativism, whatever you want to call it. But it's always been there. You can find this happening through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the aughts, and of course today with Donald Trump. He didn't invent this, but he did move it to the front and center of the stage.
It is interesting that you note Richard Nixon's role in advance of Joe McCarthy's, because I think a lot of people forget that he really kind of innovated the quote-unquote red baiting tactics during his campaign against Helen Gahagan Douglas for Congress, smearing her as a communist. So he was really an earlier innovator in that field, so to speak, than was McCarthy himself. And he went on with the Whittaker Chambers case to even greater heights of anti-communist fighting acclaim. And then, of course, later on, turned that to his advantage when he actually approached China as president. But of course, eventually he innovated or was played a role in innovating the Southern strategy, which was another step in this psychosis, which represented a shift in exploiting the grievance of especially white Southerners during the 1968 election, at least for the first time. Something that he used and that politicians like George Wallace also used at that time.
Yeah, I mean, that's, as I say, you can find examples of this exploitation of extremism for every Republican nominee and president. And in Nixon's case, it's interesting that in 1960, when he ran for president against John Kennedy, Barry Goldwater and other Republicans urged him to basically dump black votes in the North. Black Americans had long supported the Republican Party because of its association with Lincoln. And he was urged to dump those votes and instead to appeal to white Southerners to get the Electoral College votes of the South and steal them from the Democrats who had a lock on those votes. And Nixon in the 1960s said no, he wasn't going to do that. He wasn't going to adopt a Southern strategy then. And he even went on to write a piece for Ebony magazine about how the Republican Party should do a better job of appealing to black voters. But comes 68, when he has two threats facing him. One is George Wallace, who you mentioned, who was formerly a Democrat, a segregationist, running as an independent for the South, and Nixon worried that he would get those, win a few votes, win a few states in the South, and sabotage Nixon's path to victory. But the other threat before that was a guy named Ronald Reagan, who had been elected governor of California in '66, and who had become the darling of the right, the Goldwater right, and was running somewhat not too stealthy secret campaign for president, which he was hoping to get delegates at the convention to bolt from Nixon and nominate him. And Nixon was worried that Reagan would steal the nomination from him. So he cut a deal with Strom Thurmond,
Right.
former Democrat, now Republican, also segregationist, a South Carolina senator, to basically hold the Southern delegates in line for Nixon. And Nixon agreed to appoint only conservative justices who would not be keen to support federal initiatives to desegregate and to advance civil rights. He also said that he would not pick a vice presidential candidate who would offend the Southerners. And
Spiro Agnew worked pretty well for that, I guess.
Spiro Agnew ended up working very well. Agnew was the governor of Maryland and was seen as a race baiter, though not an outright Southerner, but Southerners liked him.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite ugly tidbits is at the convention, Nixon told John Mitchell, his campaign manager at the time, to tell the Southern delegates that there would be in a Nixon presidency, there would be no more, quote, pro-Negro crap, end quote.
Wow.
So he cut a deal with with white supremacists to save his nomination and then to campaign for him in the general election against Humphrey. And he, won not all, but most of the South, and very, very, very narrowly defeated Hubert Humphrey.
Stephanie Miller's Happy Hour podcast. Hey, remember when we started it, we said if Donald Trump makes you want to drink and swear, this is the podcast for you? Doesn't he still want to make you drink and swear?
Yes,
Because he won't
does.
ever shut the F up, will he? Ever. He won't ever go away. Won't ever stop saying the election was rigged and made to make it.
So we're going to keep drinking and keep making happy hours.
Yes, it's happy hour somewhere. We live by that. And
Yeah.
this is the best interviews of the week on the Stephanie Miller Show. Whoever the big newsmakers are, politicians, comedians, we have just amazing guests.
Yep.
And happy hour focuses on the very best of the Stephanie Miller Show that week.
Yeah, and we have a lot of fun making it as well.
Right.
So you will have a
Fun is still allowed.
Yes.
in Donald Trump's America. Yes.
It is hard to believe, but fun is still allowed, particularly on the happy hour. And lots of swearing, lots of drinking, lots of...
Whatever gets through the night, whatever gets through the day, that's what the happy hour is there for.
It's available wherever you get your podcast, correct?
That is correct.
And sexyliberal.com. Get it now. Stephanie Miller's Happy Hour podcast.
The John Fugelsang podcast is now available 6 times a week with me, John Fugelsang. I've been murdered on CSI, picketed by Westboro Baptist Church, and host Tell Me Everything on Sirius XM Progress 127. You will hear authors, politicians, actors, filmmakers, rappers, rock stars, journalists, activists, unhinged callers, and way too many comedians. They all have a place on the John Fugelsang podcast, and so do you. The John Fugelsang podcast, fair and biased. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to pods.
Stephanie Miller's Happy Hour podcast. Hey, remember when we started it, we said if Donald Trump makes you want to drink and swear, this is the podcast for you? Doesn't he still want to make you drink and swear?
Yes,
Because he won't
does.
ever shut the F up, will he? Ever. He won't ever go away. Won't ever stop saying the election was rigged and made to make it.
So we're going to keep drinking and keep making happy hours.
Yes, it's happy hour somewhere. We live by that. And
Yeah.
this is the best interviews of the week on the Stephanie Miller Show. Whoever the big newsmakers are, politicians, comedians, we have just amazing guests.
Yep.
And happy hour focuses on the very best of the Stephanie Miller Show that week.
Yeah, and we have a lot of fun making it as well.
Right.
So you will have a
Fun is still allowed.
Yes.
in Donald Trump's America. Yes.
It is hard to believe, but fun is still allowed, particularly on the happy hour. And lots of swearing, lots of drinking, lots of...
Whatever gets through the night, whatever gets through the day, that's what the happy hour is there for.
It's available wherever you get your podcast, correct?
That is correct.
And sexyliberal.com. Get it now. Stephanie Miller's Happy Hour podcast.
We're speaking with David Korn. He is an investigative reporter and the author of American Psychosis. There are a lot of different stops on this train of American psychopathy, but I guess I'm wondering what you think the point was at which Republicans really stopped trying to win elections by fighting for conservative principles primarily and start trying to win them either by rigging or stealing elections.
That's a good question, because there's always, the Republican Party has had ideology to it. It's always been for smaller government and libertarian issues, while though wanting a big military and not minding big deficits if they are the result of tax cuts for the wealthy. But it's also had this extreme anti-government paranoid element to it too, where there was in Goldwater using the John Birchers as foot soldiers in his 1964 campaign, or it was the Ronald Reagan and both Bushes embracing the Christian right, even as the Christian right was, sometimes calling even for the execution of gay people, but was out there peddling its own form of hatred. I think we see in 2000, the party has always tried to exploit extremism, but also while often trying to advance some of its own ideologies and policies. But I think we see with Palinism, which is, the 2008 campaign, a shift in the Republican base, where the base really just wants the hate and the enmity that is coming from Sarah Palin. When she's attacking Barack Obama and the crowd is chanting, kill him, kill him, or people are telling John McCain they don't trust Barack Obama because he's a secret Muslim. I think this was where the party starts to go off the rails. And it's being driven off the rails in part because its base is having absorbed a lot of this conspiracism, from people like Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh, are now demanding that the party leaders deliver on it. And they want to, if Barack Obama really is a threat to the country because he's a secret Muslim, they want party leaders who will reflect that to them and endorse that to them. And from there we get to the Tea Party, which the core of the Tea Party, although there was a libertarian anti-government part to it, I think the psychological energy of the Tea Party was the belief that Barack Obama really was a secret African socialist Muslim who wanted to destroy America by wrecking the economy so he can impose a totalitarian dictatorship. I mean, that's what they were saying. That's what Glenn Beck was saying every night. And he was sort of the moral guide of the Tea Party. And so from there, you get to Trump, and it's, a very, very, very short, skip and a hop. So I do think, while this dark side of the party has always been there, we can see in 2008, something changed to make it a little bit different.
Interesting. It's interesting that you choose that point before the Tea Party itself, and I guess in a way, that sort of I want to call it a split ticket, between McCain on the one hand and Palin on the other, kind of representing two different parts of what was then the Republican Party, does seem like an apt point at which to call it, because even though they lost that election, like the internal fight in a way was kind of decisively called at that point for Palinism, if you want to call it that.
And that point is, I think you're right, Beowulf, to focus on that. That point really does reflect this long-term battle in the Republican Party. When people say battle for the soul, whatever, I don't care. But to be fair to Sarah Palin, if I must, when she started attacking Barack Obama for palling around with terrorists, which kind of, was the trigger for all this. She was doing that under precise orders from the McCain campaign. And the McCain campaign decided to run ads declaring that Obama had palled around with terrorists, which was a way of feeding into the birtherism and the othering of Obama and the argument that he wasn't a real American. Now, I knew John McCain, and there was a lot about John McCain that I really liked, particularly before the 2008 campaign. And he was a guy who I think cared about policy and cared about ideas and his vision of America. But during that campaign, he did accede, or he institutionally, to some of these worst elements within the party, and ended up being subsumed by that part of the party.
Yeah. And my sense is that in combination with the economic downturn that happened in 2008 and then the midterms in 2010, which manifested themselves in large part in the Tea Party movement, really we see the impact of that happening in a way, because you layer on all the economic stress, which so often finds its outlet in xenophobia and racism and the type of racial othering that you're talking about here. And I certainly remember the day after Glenn Beck's then much lauded September 12th, his 9/12 movement, and the day that he held that on in 2010 as a sort of ramp up to the midterm elections that year. There were people in my little semi-rural corner of southern Oregon who were marching in the streets, and I remember that day that there was someone in full Nazi regalia on the streets there, and I knew that something like fundamental and evil had been unleashed, and I think that's exactly what you're talking about in this book.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I call it American psychosis for a reason. A lot of these issues come about because a large number of Americans are believing things that are not true. Not that they're wrong policy-wise. There was no immense conspiracy to turn the U.S. government over to the Soviets in the 1950s. Barack Obama was not born in Kenya. He did not have a secret plan to destroy the country. Donald Trump, the election was not stolen from him. But millions of Americans have believed these things, and that has led to the Republican Party exploiting that and encouraging beliefs that often are tied to hatred and bigotry. You're right. With the Glenn Beck rally, I write about it in the book itself. That particular rally, as it manifested itself in Washington D.C.
Right.
And that's why I say that the Republicans have encouraged and exploited. They didn't create the extremism, but they often went out there and said, yeah, you're right to feel this way. Come vote for us. And that's, ultimately the problem the country faces is not Donald Trump, but the fact that there are millions of Americans. It's not a majority, but it's a large number of Americans who believe the conspiracy theories and want to believe the conspiracy theories that he and the Republicans and far-right, not so far-right players have been dishing out, whether it's QAnon, election denial, or that Antifa was behind January 6th. And if this stuff didn't take hold, Trump would be nowhere. But it does take hold. It is a form of political psychosis. And the Republicans, rather than trying to cure it, they cultivate it. And it's, been on the side for decades. And they don't talk about doing this. They try and do it on the side of it. But Trump put it front and center.
Yeah. So when you have a person who has a mental illness, you look to avenues like medication, talk therapy, etc. But when you have a nation, certainly one political party that has been taken over by a political psychosis, and there's while its leader is at the moment out of power, and there is still a very strong threat to the American political system and to democracy, such as it is in America. What are the avenues that we can take? What are the solutions that we can use at this point in order to get better? What can we do to balance ourselves mentally? What can we do to address this national mental illness that we have? It's not an easy thing, and it involves a lot of people who have a lot of power and who could make a lot of trouble. How do we get down from this?
That's the ultimate question. When I first started working on American Psychosis a year ago, and I called it a historical investigation of how the Republican Party went crazy, a historical investigation. I, in some ways, did not expect it to be as timely as I believe it is right at this moment, particularly now that we're having a conversation, I think a healthy conversation, about the impact of MAGA extremism on the Republican Party and whether this is akin to fascism or semi-fascism. I think that my book provides a wonderful historical context for that sort of discussion now, so that we realize that what the nation is dealing with is not an aberration. It's not the product of one man, Donald Trump, being politically successful. That what we're dealing with is a strain of American political life that has been there for decades and that runs quite deep. And that the idea of just going back to a pre-Trump Republican Party is not going to do the trick, now that the furies that the Republican Party has always played with have been completely unleashed. So I think that understanding this is one of the first steps to think in thinking towards what to do about this. If this is indeed the case, that this is not an aberration, but a culmination of what's been going on for decades, then you don't flip it off like a switch. You don't turn it off with a switch.
Yeah.
And keeping Trump out of office, voting him out of office, is not going to do the trick either.
Right, because you're going to have a DeSantis or a Rick Scott or a Greg Abbott, or you're coming to replace him.
Trumpism is still here. You see it in DeSantis and others, and you see it with state officials winning elections and trying to take over the vote counting system. You see it in the exploitation of racism with, by talking about CRT. I mean, it's, Trumpism is still out there, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, if you understand the roots of it, then you kind of look at it and say, okay, 20, 30% of the country, whatever it might be, is stuck in this mode. As you want to call it, they have this political disease. This is how they think, and they're not persuadable.
Yeah.
They're not persuadable. So then what do? Can you find ways to segregate them politically? I'm talking about,
right, not
physically, segregate them politically and work literally only on the margins. You're not trying to persuade Trump voters, but there are people, and the middle is very thin, who might be drawn to Trump for other reasons. And if you can convince them that there is an authoritarian threat, that it's real, and you get people who are sympathetic to the argument, Democrats, independents, who may not feel it so strongly or think about it that much, to see the threat more clearly and to realize that it is a clear and present danger.
Yeah.
And so you get, so basically, if you want to isolate the people who are engaged in this political form of American psychosis.
Yeah.
And that still is a problem because they still have disproportionate political power thanks to gerrymandering and the structure of the Senate. But I think you think conceptually about, okay, we're not going to make them go away. We're not going to convince them. How do we keep them contained and go and work around them?
I mean, it's very interesting that you say that because we've just been through COVID and, so many people have had to go through quarantines of one kind or another. And I think basically what you're suggesting is good practice for a disease, in this case a mental disease, which is a political quarantine. And this is not something that we haven't seen in America like just a generation ago. When I came of age in the 1990s, this kind of political thought was on the margins. It was isolated. It was quarantined. It was there, but it was on the fringes. It was under rocks. It was viewed with distaste. And I think that's what we have to get back to. And if you look at Biden's recent speech in Philadelphia, for as many criticisms as he has received and for as many criticisms as I may have of his policies, I think it is absolutely the right step to call this out and make it the purpose of the Democratic Party and all legitimate political parties in this country to say this is not something that is acceptable within the mainstream. We're a democracy, and we're not silencing people here, but we are going to view this as anathema as far as we are concerned, and that's where it needs to go. And that's how we need to move forward. And I think eventually, once the Republican Party processes this illness, it will be transformed significantly, hopefully to something almost unrecognizable. And it too will come forward and say, we may have different principles from you, but this kind of speech, this kind of hate politics is something that we will relegate to the far margins of our ideology.
I unfortunately agree. It's a less interesting conversation, but I think that's it. I think people who are not part of an authoritarian movement here need to combine forces, because if you lose your democracy, then you won't be able to argue about all the things we need to argue about, whether it's climate change, economic inequality, taxation, whatever it is. You don't have, to deal with any problem we have to preserve our democracy.
Yeah.
So I find myself in, the strange company of people like George Conway and Bill Kristol and those Republicans and conservatives who, see Trump's authoritarianism for what it is. And, as conservative as they are, their conservatism does not lead them towards support of authoritarianism.
Right.
And, I've argued with these people for years. I believe they've done some great damage to the world and to the country. But I, now recognize that there is a threat at the door of our democracy and that we need, what in old days would be called the popular front,
right,
to work together to isolate, contain. It's what it was like sort of the Cold War strategy of dealing with the Soviet Union, containment.
Yeah,
keep it from spreading. You can't beat them, in a war. Yeah, dead on. Yeah. So how do you isolate them and get the rest of the world organized and pursuing, hopefully, liberal democracy?
Yeah. And I definitely believe that reach across the aisle, although the aisle is so different than it used to be, is critical because they understand, the Bill Kristols and the George Conways, that if we don't have a basis to work from in politics, if we don't have some common ground on which we can both stand and speak to one another, then this project is dead, and we have to have that. Otherwise, we are. We're in a very, very bad place. But with common ground, we can get there. And so I'm so glad that you are in touch with and agreeing and reaching out with those folks. I think it is a moment to form a true National Front. We've been speaking with David Korn. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I hope that American Psychosis, my new book, allows people to sort of see the long history here so they realize what needs to happen and that it's going to take a while too, not in the short term, to form the type of political alliances that you spoke of and the political force to counter what has been occurring for at least 7 decades.
Yes, absolutely. Again, we've been speaking with David Korn. He is a #1 New York Times bestselling author, and his book out now is American Psychosis. David, thank you so much for being with us today on Facepalm America.
Thank you.
The John Fugelsang podcast is now available 6 times a week with me, John Fugelsang. I've been murdered on CSI, picketed by Westboro Baptist Church, and host Tell Me Everything on Sirius XM Progress 127. You will hear authors, politicians, actors, filmmakers, rappers, rock stars, journalists, activists, unhinged callers, and way too many comedians. They all have a place on the John Fugelsang podcast, and so do you. The John Fugelsang podcast, fair and biased. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to pods. The John Fugelsang podcast is now available 6 times a week with me, John Fugelsang. I've been murdered on CSI, picketed by Westboro Baptist Church, and host Tell Me Everything on Sirius XM Progress 127. You will hear authors, politicians, actors, filmmakers, rappers, rock stars, journalists, activists, unhinged callers, and way too many comedians. They all have a place on the John Fugelsang podcast, and so do you. The John Fugelsang podcast, fair and biased. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to pods.
Stephanie Miller's Happy Hour podcast. Hey, remember when we started it, we said if Donald Trump makes you want to drink and swear, this is the podcast for you? Doesn't he still want to make you drink and swear?
Yes,
because he won't
does.
ever shut the F up, will he? Ever. He won't ever go away. Won't ever stop saying the election was rigged and made to make it.
So we're going to keep drinking and keep making happy hours.
Yes, it's
Yes.
happy hour somewhere. We live by that. And this is the best interviews of the week on the Stephanie Miller Show. Whoever the big newsmakers are, politicians, comedians, we have just amazing guests.
Yep.
And happy hour focuses on the very best of the Stephanie Miller Show that week.
Yeah, and we have a lot of fun making it as well.
Right.
So you will have a
Fun is still allowed.
Yes.
in Donald Trump's America? Yes.
It is hard to believe, but fun is still allowed, particularly on the happy hour. And lots of swearing, lots of drinking, lots of...
Whatever gets through the night, whatever gets through the day, that's what the happy hour is there for.
It's available wherever you get your podcast, correct?
That is correct.
And sexyliberal.com. Get it now. Stephanie Miller's Happy Hour podcast.